Welcome to devMode.fm, a podcast dedicated to the tools, techniques, and technologies used in modern web development. I'm Andrew Welch from NY Studio 107.
I'm Jonathan Melville from MDD in Atlanta.
I am Jake Dohm from Good Work.
And today we have on Sean Larkin from Microsoft. How you doing, Sean?
Hey, I'm doing good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming on, and we're here to talk about Webpack. So if you were eating a whale steak in a small pub in Keflavik, Iceland, and a Viking strode over to you and he asked you, hey, what is Webpack anyway? What would you tell him?
Well, first, I'd invite him to the Blue Lagoon so we could go and hang out in the spa. But then I would tell him that Webpack is a tool that helps people use modern technologies like modules and things that didn't work in the browser and allows it to work for them. It's really diluted version, but if you wanted a more in-depth pitch, since we have some time in the spa, I would say that Webpack allows you to use a variety of different module formats that don't necessarily work in the browser, like AMD, CommonJS, and also allows you to bundle it into one or many JavaScript files.
Yeah. So in a really short, concise version would be that it's a JavaScript bundler.
Yeah, you're right.
Right, where it will take stuff, and this is something that when we're doing the PicoWeb discussion, we were talking about it, that one of the reasons why you need this stuff to begin with, like if you Browserify or Webpack or whatever it ends up being, is that people want to use NPM, and NPM is for node modules that they don't run in the web browser, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a couple of times given like 16-hour workshops, and I've done 3-hour workshops on Webpack. And there's always something that there's like mandatory course, no matter what the length is. And that's why. Like, why does this exist? And You really touch on that, which is it kind of has to do with how we use JavaScript today, the birth of JavaScript modules, the explosion of NPM and JavaScript in our ecosystem, and then kind of like the Wild West of how anybody can really choose what they want to publish to NPM. And that's what front-end developers really kind of adopted as their way of being able to access, share, and distribute JavaScript, in the ecosystem.
Now, if we lived in some kind of bizarro comic book forked universe and Bower ended up coming out on top in terms of where everyone was putting their stuff, would we still have Webpack?
I still think so, right? Because one of the polls, it wasn't like what folder it ends up into. It's what's the syntax and what is the format that people are writing this code in, right? I think really what excited and allowed developers to heavily adopt the usage of NPM was that in Node, the default was using CommonJS modules. And people were like, oh my gosh, for the first time, I can have a module system. I can have, modularity in my code. I can share pieces of it without it being a mess. And that's really what got front-end developers excited about using it, in my opinion.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I want to know a little bit more about you. How did you end up becoming a core maintainer? So the Webpack project was originally created by Tobias Koppers, right?
Tobias Koppers, you're right.
Tobias?
Yes,
okay.
Tobias.
But when I look it up in Wikipedia, like you're number 2. Like, how did you get in there? What's going on?
It's okay. Let's sit down and drink our coffee here. So
all right.
It's a good story, I guess. I'll try and rewind a little bit. Before I worked at Microsoft, I worked at 2 other companies. The first one was kind of a contracting job that I didn't really have a great experience at. But long story short, it was the first time that I ever interacted with Webpack as a tool, right? Previously, I'd only been using Grunt and Gulp, and I was doing Angular work, but this was a React shop. And
now, be honest, your first interaction with Webpack, did you love it or hate it, or
what version? What version of Webpack?
It was like Webpack 1.14, I think. It was the stable one at the time. And but get this, though. My first experience was one of the most incredible experiences I can ever describe. I remember for the first time seeing this brilliant interactive feedback of the build, seeing the percentage. I remember making a change to a file and instantly the browser reloading.
Ooh.
I remember seeing the hot module replacement and like the hair, like
the religious experience.
Like, the hair stands up on your neck. It stands up on my arm. And I'm like, my eyes open and it's like, what is this?
What is this magic?
I've never had a developer experience like this so far.
Right.
I remember how miserably long the gulp and grunt builds were. I remember, how I had to refresh the browser. We had to use these crazy plugins for the browser that never worked, right? And so trying this for the first time, it blew me away. And although I didn't stay at this company long, every waking day I spent obsessing about wanting to have this experience more. And so I was in Nebraska at the time, and I took a job at Mutual of Omaha, and I brought Webpack there. And I didn't really know much about it, but I started speaking at conference. They were really supportive about it. And so my first conference I got to speak at was, how you use Angular and Webpack 2, right? It was just on the precipice of being released. And fast forward a little bit, I wanted to help on Webpack. At the time when I was at NGConf, and I was naive and not understanding there's a process and this is really not something that's been explored before. And so the Angular team said, okay, but we need to know what's Webpack's timelines? What's their milestones? What kind of funding are they looking for? And all these things that I had no answers to these questions because I'm not a maintainer. I'm just some random dude who, got some chills on his neck because he likes Webpack. So I reached out at the time, Gitter.im is one of these interactive GitHub chats. I reached out to Juho Vepsalainen, also known as @Babra on Twitter, who is also kind of one of the maintainers at the time. And I said, hey, I would love to, meet all of the maintainers of Webpack, and I would like to get them together and say hey, how can I help fund this project and be involved? And so they threw them all together in a private chat, and I ambushed them. I said, hey, how can I get you paid? And I need to know this giant list of questions. And nobody really had answers because it wasn't really an organized project then.
Well, that's a way to get everyone together is when you say, how do I get you money? Right.
Right. And then I guess trying to not ramble over this story too much longer, Kent C. Dodds was doing a JavaScript Air podcast, a live one. And the whole reasoning behind this was I was so obsessed with this team and wanting to learn more about the project and the people behind it. I was Googling Tobias Koppers online. What does he look like, right? Because his avatar is hidden.
Sean,
I just wanted to have a better idea of who these people were.
Sean, we don't call this, this is not research. This is called stalking.
I know. It's true. It's true. Guilty. I was stalking. And so I just wanted to see what he looked like, right? You want to know the face behind these projects.
Sure.
And eventually I saw that Kent C. Dodds was doing this JavaScript Air with the Webpack team. And I'm like, oh my gosh, we're going to get to see them live for the first time in person.
Right.
And so I reached out to somebody who knew Kent and I said, hey, Kent, can you please get me on this podcast? I would love to just sit in the back, the foreground, right? I won't say anything. I just want to be in the presence of the people whom I admire, who made such an amazing software. And
so you were a fanboy at that point.
Seriously. Absolutely. Yeah. And so basically a week before, I don't know if Kent was trying to save face or, when he produced the media for this for this episode, it said introducing the Webpack team. And so there's 3 icons of the Webpack team, and then there's my icon next to them. And I'm like, so I go to my coworker, and I'm just sitting in the morning. I go, look at this. What is this? What is happening? And so, there's some jokes, that week or the day of the episode, Tobias and Juho are they kind of made a joke about it, and they're like, would you like to join the team? I said, absolutely. Right. I had only had 1 commit to the project at the time. Right. Right. And then this happened. And so it's kind of dumb luck. Right.
That's crazy.
But I think, I really got my following, or I think, we really started to make progress once I had my presence on Twitter, right? So at the time, I was so terrified to contribute because the code base is pretty, it's very modular. It's a plugin based architecture. It's event driven system. And so there's lots of misdirection or indirection, and it's really hard to navigate yourself through the code base for Webpack. And so I just did what I did best, right? I have a tech support background, and I was like, okay, I'm just going to go on Twitter. I'm going to search Webpack. I'm just going to help whatever people that are on and get the response. And so I did that for maybe 9 months, 12 months, I don't know. And then I started doing it longer. I started getting invites to conference talks, even more so. And then really helped finish the Webpack 2 process, right? Doing commits and landing a bunch of changes to help get there for the sake of education and my love for the project. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of just a crazy dumb luck story. And I'm fortunate enough for Kent C. Dodds to call me a member of the Webpack team.
So you were just going there to try and get your album cover autographed. And they said, hey, you want to join the band?
Yep, that's exactly it.
Do you autograph my Webpack 1.14 edition?
Yes, exactly.
That's such a cool story, though, and it's a great way for people listening who are wondering how they should contribute to open source if they have this cool project that they love and what they can do, with a really sometimes intimidating code base, whether it would be on a framework or Webpack or whatever it may be. If you just hop on the GitHub issues or their Discord or Slack or whatever channel and see what issues people are having with, if you just show up there and start to help with little things here and there and get familiarity that way, that's such a great way to contribute. Communities need that, and it takes a load off of core contributors too, so that they can be working on features and things like that.
Totally. And that's kind of like how my role has been adopted now, thanks to our fundraising and obviously, once I joined, there were some organizational changes. We created a core team. We joined with Open Collective. We, joined a foundation for legal protection. And so things started getting real. But now, fast forward to today, after 3 years of being involved in the project, we now have a $500,000 budget in our Open Collective and still aggressively trying to fundraise for more. But now Tobias is full time on Webpack.
Nice.
And so my job is to help not only raise sponsorships and fundraising, it's to work with partners and potential customers who use Webpack and showing what our impact can be when you help sponsor us, and even more so, I wouldn't be here at Microsoft today if it wasn't for my contributions to open source. And so literally they took me into the office and said hey, we've seen your talks, we've seen your code, and we want you to work here. And I fell over in the chair. But it turns out that Webpack is the second most used open source project here at Microsoft.
Right. And I wanted to ask you about that because I found out that you worked at Microsoft on the Edge team, right? And okay, I realize that there are stereotypes and a lot of them are wrong, but
of course,
when I think of Microsoft, I don't think of Webpack. I don't think of modern JavaScript. I think ASP.NET and stodgy old stuff. And it sounds like I'm totally wrong about that.
I mean, yes and no, right? In the past 5 years, things have changed completely. I wouldn't work.
Who owns GitHub now?
Right. Who owns GitHub?
There you go.
Right. Who's the largest open source contributor in the world?
Is it Microsoft?
It's Microsoft.
Wow.
Yeah. Who created TypeScript and VS Code, the editor that everybody loves to use?
Right.
See, what I find so amazing is that we've turned to open source as a means for us to solve our problems publicly, right? And it turns out that we write code the same way that everybody else does. And that's why it's so powerful, because when we solve for ourselves, we get to solve for you.
Right.
And so it's instant innovation that really kind of, it gets viral really quickly. Look how fast TypeScript caught steam or how quickly VS Code was adopted.
Yeah. And I find this whole thing, your whole story is amazing because it's something I say all the time. There are lots of very smart people in this world, and it does take a little bit of luck, for the people that really take off, because there are lots of equally smart people, and sometimes you just got to be in the right place at the right time. And now I see you on Twitter, you're dancing on beaches, you're diving off bridges, you're bathing in the Blue Lagoon in Iceland,
true.
You're living the life, right?
Yeah, I'm so blessed, and there's a little privilege involved, but I'm just so fortunate to be where I am today. And I mean, I can't discount the work that I've done for Webpack, but at the same time, I wish that there were more people who had stories like mine.
Right.
And so, I try and share that story, not to brag or not to be look how lucky I got. It's more hey, just take your greatest talents and apply it to an open source project you love, right?
Yes.
And who knows what could happen. You could be at Microsoft doing incredible things.
And I think that I don't think that the story you told came off like that at all.
Sure.
I thought it was very humbling because you were very clear that, I was just using this thing. I just kind of fell backwards into it. But you make a really, really good point, is that if you find a project, an open source project that you care about, take whatever it is you're good at and start using it and apply it to that project. Because the absolute worst case is that you'll kind of be adhering to the camper's motto and you'll be making things better than you left it. Right.
Exactly.
And the best case is that something awesome happens.
Yeah, totally. Right. And it's not just limited to development, right? It's I'm not the most brilliant person in the world. I think Tobias has a brilliant mind and he has a huge aptitude for software engineering. I may be kind of just middle of the road, right? I'm a 3x engineer. And so like I got to work a little bit harder to figure out harder concepts, and this really comes natural to him. And so it just made sense for me to focus on being in the community and using my interpersonal skills or using my communication skills. And like, so even if you're not a programmer, but let's say you're a tech writer or you're doing legal work or I don't know, doing design work, like we would love those kind of contributions because it's the things you're great at and it provides really special impact to a project.
Yeah, and you can write the most complicated, amazing code in the world, but if no one finds out about it, like who cares?
Yeah, and if the API sucks or if it's not documented, yeah, absolutely. That was Webpack, 2012 and 2013.
Right. And
I'm glad you made that joke so I didn't have to, Sean.
Well, yeah, and I think that documentation is huge if you are building a framework or a thing that you want other people to then start adopting, as is you outreaching to try and help people with problems and help them learn it. Right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And like the more, this is one thing that I really took away from my first year at Microsoft, which is that as a program manager, it's our jobs to really put zero distance between our customers, the feedback, and the things that we're creating. Right. And so bringing that to the table as a part of Webpack has really allowed our future, like the progress that we've made in the last 2 years to really thrive, or at least in the features that we brought to the table, really just show like, hey, we're actually listening, and the feedback that you give us, like, we run with it, right? And we make something out of it.
Yeah. And, as a testament to all of this, I mean, one of the reasons why I did this huge article on Webpack and what inspired it was you, right? And I mentioned that to you. And I mentioned that in the article that I tweeted at you and I basically said, well, Webpack is kind of like a black box. And you said back to me, it is until you open it. Like, here's the docs, like dive in, go learn something.
I still remembered that day, that exact tweet. Right, because your icon is really memorable on Twitter, and so so I remember the exact tweet, that exact conversation to this day. The first time I interacted with you.
Wow, that's crazy. That's crazy. Like I had no idea because I know that you're a busy person. Lots of people want to have pieces of you. Like I had no idea that you remember that. But I wanted to mention that because, that ties into what we were talking about before in terms of use what you're good at. And that kind of outreach makes a huge difference in terms of people deciding to adopt the technology. Had you ignored me or said something nasty back, maybe I wouldn't have bothered.
And you know what? By all means, I'm not perfect. Like I've had my ups and downs before with the community and it happens, right? Like that's part of being human and it's part of being in the public. But like one of the greatest takeaways that I've always had is, right, if you sow these seeds of kindness, even, I call it a seed, right? Because it could only be one tweet or 140 characters or a couple of minutes of your time.
Right.
And it can really kind of sprout into something super special or really impactful down the road. So yeah, I think it's always so much worth taking the time to sow those kind of seeds.
All right. Well, let's get into some of the grimy, gritty details of Webpack.
All right.
So the first thing I want to ask about is Webpack. Is it still lowercase w whenever I write this thing?
It is always. Always.
Why?
You can go to our webpack.js.org/branding because it's in our branding guide.
Well, I'm looking. So one of the things that I have open, and I've had this open on my computer for probably 4 months. Your face is staring back at me. I'm looking at Front-End Masters Webpack 4 Fundamentals with Sean Larkin. Okay.
Yes.
And I've gone back and forth on buying the course because I did kind of a deep dive on Webpack. I don't consider myself an expert by any means, but I went in pretty deep, right? I mean, I went in, I came out a month later and I was a changed man. Okay. And
baptized.
Yeah. And I was looking at this course and I'm like, maybe I should buy this before I end up, we end up having Sean on to talk to him about it, but I never did. But I'm looking at this page and I got to tell you, Sean, Webpack, the W is capitalized.
I try not to, you got to pick and choose your battles. So
okay.
I just said, I said, that's supposed to be a lowercase w, but I let it slide.
They didn't adhere to the branding guide.
No, they
which
didn't.
Looks quite nice, actually.
Thank you very much. Yeah. was created by one of our core team.
I realize I'm being pedantic about it, but what is the reasoning for the lowercase w? Do you not want it to be a proper noun?
I think it was just stylistic.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Designers, sure. Right? Am I right?
Oh yeah, we got one here. I mean, Jonathan.
You're right.
Jonathan's classical training is in design, so we got one here. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I would go with the lowercase w. I think it looks better.
Same.
But okay, so forget about the branding because let's get into the guts of it. So
right,
who is Webpack targeting? Who is the person that you're building this thing for?
Many people might say it's meant for lower level developer. It's supposed to be close to the middle, or for those who are wanting to work on a build system or build a tool around it, to build a website. But honestly, our target day one has always been every single person, right? Anybody who is writing for the web who wants to take their JavaScript and ship it in a way that's super performant. That's who our customer is. It also happens that one of our core principles is that it's supposed to be infinitely extendable, right? So we've not always had the best defaults, and it's not always been the best for somebody starting out for the first time. But the goal is that we want to cover the spectrum, right? Be anything to everyone or to anyone. Yeah, the goal is really just be anything to anybody, or we want to cover that entire spectrum. And I think it's changed a lot over time, and we've really started to focus on more the developer who doesn't really care how their build tools work, and just want to focus on writing a website.
So I can tell you, just a little bit about me and my background. So I come from an app development background, so like C, working with GCC and LVM and all that kind of fun stuff. When I was approaching learning Webpack, I think what was the most complicated thing was just learning all of the lingo and the kind of what various things were being called in terms of, entry points, outputs, loaders, plugins, et cetera, et cetera.
Absolutely. Yeah, some you can just blame Tobias for, because he's English as second language. So he's going to choose, and he loves wordy words, I guess. So we have a lot of those kind of words. He comes from a C# background. So, you have a lot of context module factory or things like that in the backgrounds of our APIs. And sometimes they kind of leak forward into the user kind of API itself. But, you're right, though. A lot of people can describe Webpack as being a tool that you build on top of and you create a platform or a developer experience on top of.
Right.
And that's really what, in the most recent time, I worked with, I even remember working with Dan, when he got on a screen call with me and he was like, "Hey, Sean, we have this idea and we want to call it Create React App." And so I remember when he first showed that to me and I was like, I don't know, maybe you should expose the Webpack config. He's like, no, because we don't want to support it.
Right.
And I said, okay, makes sense, but good luck. And, obviously that was really successful. And so Angular followed suit. And I kind of had to drag Webpack to the Angular team, but that's another story for another time. But yeah, my greatest example is that we know why Vue.js is so hot and so popular. And that's because, Evan, you built the entire framework with consideration of Webpack as being the primary tool used. Or he built the single file component system is literally a platform made from Webpack and loaders and using ES modules, right? And so it's so popular and it's such a, it just drips developer experience because the framework author considered that build tool as being, I don't want to say weapon, but it was actually kind of a complement to the entire experience.
Right. And that's amazing when you get these layers of technology. And because Webpack is providing this amazing foundation, Evan was probably like, you know what? I can do this, or I can have a .vue file and it can have the template code, the JavaScript, and the styles all in one place. And I can just make a Webpack loader and, away we go. But just so we don't get too ahead of ourselves. So in Webpack, how does it work? So my understanding is that Webpack only knows about JavaScript. Is that correct?
So as of Webpack 3, that was correct. In Webpack 4, we do support a couple other what we call module types. But you're right in saying that really the world in Webpack is very JavaScript centric. Right. You provide a JavaScript entry point, and there's three main phases. We have create the dependency graph, optimize the graph, and then render it or output the bundles.
Right.
So the first step is literally you start at an entry point. It collects the source for that file. We parse it and we see, hey, do we have any other import or require statements or any module statements inside of this code? If there is, then we stitch together what we call dependencies, right? These are pointing towards other modules. And then we repeat that process, right? So we go to each file and we say, well, for each dependency here, let's make sure it exists, pull the source code, parse it, and then find dependencies in there. And so that's just this kind of recursive algorithm that builds up a graph.
And I think this is where you might lose, quote unquote, everyone. Right. And the reason why the reason why I'm saying that is that people who come from a more traditional designer dev, web development background, like, what is an entry point? Like, I don't know what that is. I just have like scripts and JavaScript is not the center of my universe. Like, the center of my universe is HTML. Right. Mm-hmm.
You're absolutely right. It turns out that if you ever need to use JavaScript, there's only one way to do it, and it's by using a script tag.
Right.
And so we're just trying to optimize that experience. I like giving the anecdote in tools like Grunt and Gulp. You had to glob these files and you had to manually tell your tool where everything lives and how to smush it together.
Right.
But the benefit here is that an entry point is just the first file that's going to kick off your entire application. And it tells Webpack what all to collect based on each of these dependency statements.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, all I'm trying to get to here is that I think people who come from a designer developer, traditional web page development background, they think of their HTML as kind of the center of the universe, whereas with Webpack, JavaScript is the center of the universe. And most of the people who were using it initially were people that were doing serious development using these front-end frameworks like Angular, Vue, React, etc., right?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And there are ways to introduce other types of assets through Webpack, but you're completely spot on. Most people don't care because it's like, well, JavaScript's just a side effect of something I have to write,
right,
or something I need to create. And a lot of times, with the amount of obnoxiously rich tooling we have in the JavaScript ecosystem, it can be overwhelming, like incredibly overwhelming to those who have no idea what a module is, or who have no idea what a dependency graph is,
right,
or anything.
We've talked on here before about how if you're just getting into web development now, how overwhelming it must seem when you look out at the landscape, especially the JavaScript landscape these days. It is just completely unbelievable the amount of tooling required just to get a simple project off the ground. And
I mean, at the same time, though, I could say, what a time we live in. Like,
yeah, that's true.
What a time to be alive, because look at all the options that we have. Or like,
right.
My joke that I always give at conferences is like, in what programming language can you say that you use syntax that doesn't exist yet?
Right.
Like, what a time to be alive. Like, how incredible is that? Well, people are making new frameworks all the time. But you're right. If people just want to get stuff done, it's hard, right? Tell me what I should choose instead of, wandering through the magic forest, choosing your own adventure.
And I think one of the initial or like a frequent criticism of Webpack is that it's too hard to configure, right? And this goes back to what you were talking about earlier, where Webpack is not trying to be this sort of high level kind of tool that serves like a lot of different needs. It's kind of like the idea is if you have a really complicated project, you need like an infinite way to configure it. And so I've never really understood that criticism, because if you try to have some tool where it's like a lot of the stuff is done for you, then you're definitely going to run into a circumstance where that's not going to meet your need.
Exactly. Extensibility is the reason why Webpack is so popular, right?
Yeah.
Because by being so pragmatic in our defaults and open-ended, that allows anybody to pick it up and use it for however they want. A lot of times we've found that we'll just make this joke. It always starts with zero config. And if it bundles for you, then you're always going to need to do something extra. So the more that you hide any kind of configurability or complexity, like, you just lose customers, right?
Yeah.
The moment, one of the things I really loved about Parcel is it gave us good ideas to be like, hey, this actually validates that we could get away with doing these defaults. But at the same time, we also saw the downfalls in the architecture, right? Like, you're basically supporting every type of asset in a single package. So if you're not even using Sass and it breaks, you're going to have to ship a major breaking change to everyone for something you don't use. Or so like there's manageability issues, but then it starts with zero config. And the moment somebody can't, they're just going to leave. They're going to go back to using a tool that they know can't be extended.
Yeah, an analogy I've made, and I don't know how accurate you think this is or is not, is that Webpack is kind of analogous to GCC or LLVM from the point of view of it's like super powerful, works with multiple languages, and it's something that everyone ends up using, even though they may be using something that is built or scaffolded on top of it.
Exactly, right? And we kind of aim to be that now. I think we're past the point where it's like, we're not battling to be better than another tool. Like we know we're the foundation and our roots are like, I would lie if I told you, I didn't strategically work with every framework to ensure that, quote, our roots are dug deep, right? Because we wanted to be the foundation. We wanted to be this platform that others can continue to build on, but also that anybody could take and kind of break apart or modularize, just like GCC or LLVM. Like you can take these pieces, use them in specific ways, leverage them to do more powerful things. But I still think that, LLVM and GCC get a lot of crap for, being hard to use for the average dev, right? So I think we still have some work there that we could do. There is still room to grow.
Yeah, well, so something you mentioned before is, in what world can you use a language that doesn't exist? And It's one of those things where everything that's old is new again. So have you heard of a little language called C++?
I've heard of it.
Never heard
used a little bit here at Microsoft.
So that language was originally a preprocessor for C, right? I mean, that's how it was built, right? So this is these kind of patterns and techniques are something that are kind of well worn and are well worn for a reason, I think.
Yeah. And I think, what's really cool is that we've inspired a lot of systems programmers, right? Like the techniques that Webpack brings to the table that nobody else did at the time was like this idea of code splitting or lazy loading pieces of your code that you don't need up front, right?
Right.
That's one of the most impactful and sole purpose for Webpack's existence, right? Is this idea of code splitting and statically generating lazy loaded bundles at build time. And so but many people in systems programming had never even heard of this, right? They didn't even know because there is no mindset for size constraints in systems.
Yeah, why would they need that?
Why does it matter?
Right, exactly. People don't care. They're going to go ship 13 gigabyte binaries, for video games.
Right.
And then we sit here for 10 minutes trying to get Forza to load, and you're like, why is this happening? But I digress. But anyway, I say to myself, I'm like, I bet they're not code splitting. But but seriously, I think we've inspired this other ecosystem at the same time where they might complain. I had a famous interaction that wasn't so positive with Gary Bernhardt, but I think the silver lining here is that he used to heavily criticize Webpack and then went on like a 6-day stint of like tweeting random bundler related questions as if it was very obvious he was writing his own bundler. And because he just wanted to use TypeScript and he was frustrated. He's like, I don't want to have to use Webpack. I don't want to have to use this loader. And I'm like, Gary, happy to help. But he's like, no, I'm going to do it. And so, he comes back after this week, right? Baptized by the fire of the ecosystem and really is
probably sobbing himself to sleep at night.
Well, he was like, wow, it turns out this stuff's actually really complex. And so I'm pulling my hair out because it's like, I just want to teach you guys. I want to teach everybody that, there's some complexities here and there's a reason why this stuff exists and why it's foundational.
Well, Sean, this is kind of like a drug addict though, right? Sometimes you have to let him hit rock bottom before you can help him. Okay.
That's really good advice. And I'm going to keep that close to me. Maybe it's me. Right.
You were mentioning before that there are, for instance, Create React App was built on top of Webpack, right? So, And then there's a Vue CLI, and then there are tools like Laravel Mix, which aims to kind of simplify things. What thoughts do you have on these tools that layer on top of Webpack? Are you happy to have them? Do you think they're just hiding away the complexity and people will eventually have to get down to the metal, or what are your kind of thoughts on these tools in general?
So like my general opinion is always, it always starts with, zero config, right? So in every application, whether you like to admit it or, you may say that's not me, not all apps, but it's literally every app is a snowflake, and you will find the business requirement to need to do something custom, and it'll need you to open up, a Webpack config maybe. So my take on this, and there's a team here, Microsoft, under Office 365, and they're working on like React UI Fabric, which is a React library, but they also have like an infrastructure team who works on like tooling. And so there's one right now, his name's Ken. He's making this project called Just Scripts. So it's Microsoft /Just Scripts. And it kind of has a basic set of scripts, like here's a basic usage of Webpack. And so half of my day is working with other teams and helping do performance evaluations and all sorts of stuff across campus. And so one of these teams is using this project. And all I wanted to do is customize one thing so I could get a special feedback output from Webpack. But I can't do it because it's abstracted and it swallows up all the console feedback. And so I'm over here, raging on my keyboard like, Ken, you need to stop overriding the default output of Webpack, right? Because I just need to see this information, or you need to make it possible for me to break in and customize it freely. So I think my opinion is like totally cool to abstract. I totally see the need and the business case and the use for it. But you better make sure that there's an easy way for the expert to go in and customize any single piece, right? So make it completely overridable.
Yeah, and that is something that all of the tools that I mentioned do, is that, for instance, Laravel Mix will have, its own little mixy kind of config, and then it will also have a Webpack config key where you can just dump in whatever you want, and that will get combined with the Webpack config that it makes. And same with Vue CLI and build React app and all those kind of things, right?
Yeah.
Jake?
Yeah, and some more kind of that even do a little bit more would be something like Nuxt or Gatsby, which abstract away some of that. But I know Gatsby and Nuxt both have a really, really good solid escape hatches where you can provide pretty directly a Webpack config. So they don't, I know Create React App is a little bit more opinionated, but Gatsby, adds a lot of features kind of on top of Webpack. And that's more of a framework that does more for you out of the box and really uses Webpack, like Sean was talking about, down closer to the metal, and then gives you options on top of it. But it still gives you those good configuration options so you can do those parts on your own.
So make it easy for me to get running.
Yep.
But if I really do need to roll up my sleeves and don't want to have Sean Larkin raging that he to stop scarfing the output, give me some kind of a way where I can get down to the bare metal for the underlying Webpack config, right?
Yeah, pave the happy path, but leave a manhole. Let them get down under the pavement if they need to.
A gaping manhole, so it's really easy to get to.
Yeah.
No, I like that. I like that.
Better analogy there.
I like that. I like that. Paving the golden path, but leaving a manhole. I like it. Even though it means that when we're configuring Webpack, by analogy, that means we're getting down into the shit.
In theory.
In theory. Yeah, in theory. In theory. So, Sean, at some point, you have to kind of be like a proud father in some ways. Like I've worked on projects where I build tools that other developers then go and build stuff on top of that. And I see the stuff that they make and I'm like, wow, that's really cool. It must seem kind of enabling for you to participate in this scaffolding foundation that tons of really awesome stuff is built on.
Yeah, like that's kind of you do take a lot of pride when you see yet another framework adopt Webpack, right? One of the ones that was really like, I don't know, it just felt really special to me because one of my first languages was Ruby, right? Mm-hmm. And although I didn't really like Ruby on Rails, sorry, DHH, I was a huge Sinatra fan, but like go figure, right? Configuration over convention. And, but when I saw DHH announce, like, hey, we're going to completely adopt Webpack. And like, I fell over. I was so proud, right? Like,
nice.
Or like, and then it went Symfony and Elixir and Phoenix and Django and, Laravel and, not just the front end frameworks, but we even have all of these backend or full stack, quote unquote, frameworks that are adopting this technology. And so it's like, that was probably the most validating for me because it's not, sometimes, I think, us JavaScript people are just drinking the JavaScript Kool-Aid and, nobody else really respects or realizes the things that we're doing. And then finally, you see these people go ahead and adopt it. Or even like what's it, I forget his name and I feel really bad about it, but he's the creator of ClojureScript. Like they're adopting, a Webpack experience using ClojureScript, and like, or even Elm, has a Webpack integration. And so it's like, it makes me really proud. And I just hope that people continue to want to build on top of it, right? Because it just like, wherever there's a limitation, then like that's our opportunity to open doors.
And Webpack has really gotten to a point now where, I mean, you really have no peers, right? Or
correct.
Well, there's Rollout.
You can say that. Rollup is really awesome. And Rich Harris is like, me and him, like we're BFFs that live on opposite coasts, and it kills me because I love going to New York and hanging out with him.
Yeah. We're having Rich on soon to talk about Svelte. So
yeah,
if you got anything you want to say to get him riled up, go ahead and do it now.
Rich, you better merge that freaking Webpack template PR I have for Svelte 3 because I've got it.
And they
perfect.
beat Webpack. They beat Webpack to like tree shaking, right? Because Rollup was the first offer.
Yeah, but he cuts corners though. So like we're spec compliant and he cuts corners. But like that's Rich Harris's code, right? Like he writes stuff that doesn't really always support the edge cases, but like that's okay, right? Because that works for his everyday life. And a lot of times that works for everyday people, doing like it just works. And so they can do a little bit more, but it might break code sometimes, so like there's trade-offs. So yeah, it might be a little bit more optimized, but I think like at the end of the day, like choosing Rollup over Webpack isn't going to get you like that's, you don't. A lot of people say like use Rollup to help bundle a library, like even in Sapper, right? I think Webpack is still the foundational tool in Sapper, which is like the meta framework for Svelte.
Well, I personally love the fact that we have some very smart people that are working on similar things, because I like that kind of competition rivalry. I think good things
competition is really good.
Yeah, I think good things can definitely come out of that. And I want to touch on something you mentioned earlier about, the respect that JavaScript developers have. I think, especially me coming from more of an app development background, I can tell you that definitely like there was a time that if you did web work, it wasn't even called development. Like a lot of the people that were doing app development didn't consider it real development at all.
Right.
And JavaScript was considered like this toy language. But man, the tables have turned. Like they really have turned, because the sheer number of people in the JavaScript community have turned it into this like beast that is just doing some amazing things. And now people are, ironically, a lot of these people are like iOS developers or whatever. Now they're being invaded by JavaScript developers that are using React Native or NativeScript to build their apps. And they're looking over their shoulder like, what the hell happened?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's so true. It's funny you mentioned like the titles thing. Like no offense to Mutual of Omaha, but we always like snarked a lot about it, is that I was called a UI UX developer. Right. But then downstairs in information services, we were in marketing, but downstairs in information services, they were called architects.
Ooh,
architects. And so, but they had no idea how the front end worked. Right. So like it was so frustrating because like they would come
and you were in marketing. That says it all. Like you're
right.
You were in marketing. That's all you need to say about what they thought of it.
We weren't in information systems. Exactly.
Yeah. And I've got a buddy of mine that I got to mention this. So he used to work at a company. I'm not going to name him or the company, but they moved to these swanky new offices, and the development team was put into an open air office space right next to the call center.
Oh my gosh.
Like literally the person in the cubicle on either side of him was like taking support calls. Just like,
good time.
I'm like, oh man, management has no idea what they're doing.
Happens.
But let's move on to more interesting stuff. So I want to have someone on to talk about WebAssemblies, because I know it's a huge topic, but I want to get into it real quick because you mentioned that there's more than one module type that you support. And I believe in addition to JavaScript, there's WebAssembly, right?
You've done your homework.
I've been playing around with WebAssembly.
Yeah, so it's WebAssembly. So the default module types in Webpack are, we have a couple flavors of JavaScript. Some is strict, some is loosey-goosey, and then there's JSON and WebAssembly. Those are the other two module types. So yes, absolutely. We were awarded $150,000 by the Mozilla Open Source Support Foundation, a grant for implementing WebAssembly as a first-class citizen in Webpack. And although,
so what is it? What is it for people that like they've heard of it, they don't know what it is? Like, what the heck is WebAssembly?
Oh man, I'm gonna butcher it, but So if you want to have somebody really great on, ask Jay Phelps. But
Okay.
and he can yell at me for getting all the things wrong if I say it wrong. So
That might be a great way to get him on.
Right,
is if you
right.
butcher stuff, he's going to want to come on and correct
is
it.
that how you got me on?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
So make sure you get it really wrong.
Okay. No, it's just JVM. No. So WebAssembly is a bytecode format
Mhm.
that allows you to take a higher level language such as C, C++, Rust, or other languages that support this target and compile it down into an intermediary binary format called WebAssembly that runs in the browser. So too long didn't read, you can take a C++ file like zlib, super popular, or some like graphics engineering, or, and you can tell LVM or Inscriptum or whatever your toolchain is to compile it to a WebAssembly target, and it spits out a WASM file, and you can run it in the browser.
Yeah. And we are definitely going to have someone come on here to talk to us more in depth about WebAssembly, but I just want to touch on it because JavaScript is one of the module formats. There's JSON, there's WebAssembly. As you mentioned, there are a couple of flavors of JavaScript. Okay, that's great, but I want CSS. Like, how does that get into the mix here? Like, if Webpack only understands JavaScript, what do we use to get it, doing our post CSS or our Sass or whatever? How does that work?
So it's really funny they mention it because we've actually gone through a couple iterations and like we've either killed the PRs or stalled them, right? Because they just were not generic enough, right? We have to be really careful, right? Because whatever we do in terms of supporting CSS, we're building it into Webpack, right? And that means this is a default now.
Right.
And so we just have to be really careful on how we choose to have this default, manifest itself. So like we've attempted it a couple times. We've closed a couple PRs once on it before, and it was okay. It was a little hacky. It didn't feel right. We saw kind of the consequences of parcels implementation, and it's not always very accurate. And it kind of concerned us, right? Like, can we really be generic enough when it comes to CSS to make it work? But we are thinking about like HTML module, right, as an entry point. That allows you to have HTML as an entry point, which I heard was, very popular aspect of Parcel, right? They could just drop an HTML file in here. It may include some JavaScript with modules, and then the bundler just takes care of it, right?
Well, so since Webpack doesn't know anything about CSS right now, we need a loader to then handle it. Is that right?
Correct. A loader will take and I won't say transpile. It'll convert it into a JavaScript module that I'm diluting it down here a little bit. So if you wanted to use CSS with Webpack, it basically converts it into a JavaScript file that says, okay, take this CSS string and slap it into a script or a style tag in the browser when the JavaScript loads.
Right. And we need that for anything. So since Webpack only understands those couple JavaScript flavors, JSON and WebAssembly, for anything else, whether it's single file view components or whether it's CSS or Sass or post CSS or whatever, we need a loader that then pulls that stuff in and transforms it and does something with it, right?
Yep, transforms it into a valid supported module type that we do support. Right. That's what's cool, though. Like loaders let you do things like you could use Rust, like a Rust source file, import it into your JavaScript, and the Rust compiler could convert that into a WASM module. And as long as that's returned, boom. It's like, as a developer, you don't have to care. Just add this source file and import it and use it just like JavaScript.
So if we want to envision this, our CSS then kind of has a JavaScript wrapper around it?
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
That's now in production modes. There's ways to work around this, right? Because there's huge performance downsides from doing this. And I criticize CSS and JS a lot about this also, because anytime that you have CSS inside of JavaScript, you're delaying your paint until JavaScript parse, evaluates, and executes, right? So if you were to actually have that CSS in an extracted style tag, in the head or link rel style sheet, whatever, then you can download and render and paint in parallel, right? That's why critical CSS is so important.
Yeah.
It gets cached too, right? I mean, like if it's
exactly.
Yeah, we're big fans of critical CSS and the purple patterns and all that kind of fun stuff here.
For sure.
So I just wanted to mention that concept because it's really important what we were talking about before about how JavaScript is kind of the center of the universe. And in order for Webpack to deal with these other things, it needs to create a JavaScript or one of these other module type wrappers around it. And that includes your CSS. That includes, a number of other things. And there, as you mentioned, there are plugins like there's the Extract Mini CSS plugin, et cetera, that will then pull it out. But the important concept that I want to get across to people is that this is something that Webpack on its own doesn't know. Like, it doesn't know anything about your CSS. Like, it knows nothing. Right?
And to be honest, like, my advice is, people are like, do I have to use CSS and JS? Like, or like, do I have to do any of this? It's like, no, like, go ahead and use whatever other tools you want to like process your CSS, put it in an HTML tag, and just any JavaScript you're using, let it be responsible, let Webpack be responsible. Yeah. One of the hard things, like the reason why we're in this situation, or maybe it's easy for me to blame CSS, but like CSS is inherently flawed in its ability to be reusable or composable.
Oh my God.
It's true. It's inherently flawed. There's no module system. You can't reuse it in a way. Right. You can't declare pieces of it. Like, there's no modularity, right? And so like that's a huge flaw of, it's not a language, but of this styling, syntax.
I agree with you, Sean. Like, I agree with everything you're saying. It's one of the reasons I'm a fan of what Adam Watham is doing with Tailwind CSS and all that.
Right.
I totally agree with you. The reason I said, oh no, is, all the CSS fans are going to be going crazy.
But it's true though. I'm sorry. It's
Eric Meyer.
Well, like, please have him on. Like, I've tweeted at him directly and said like, hey man, can we just get some way to express modularity across multiple CSS files?
Right.
Like, the problem is that like static tools can't. One, there's no mechanism for lazy loading in the syntax itself. Sorry, it's not a language. I mean,
right.
But there's no like method for me to say like I want to lazy load this piece of CSS, at this time, and that's hugely flawed, right? Because look at the average website, and 80% of the CSS that's used, that's shipped, is unused. Right. But your website has to pay for that 80% still. And it causes, the slowness, or you're still having to process that CSS through the formatter and the selector engines. And then also the inability to express modularity is like, it's inherently flawed. And I'm sorry to those who love CSS. Like, I get it. You've spent your entire life learning how every selector works. That's true, but like JavaScript's flawed too. And I love it. But yeah, CSS, it's frustrating, right? Because we've tried to speak with these teams so many times, and like, I'm glad we have people here at Microsoft who are on the CSS working group that really listen to us.
Yeah.
It's worth saying though that while there are problems with the way that CSS is loaded and modularity, like you're talking about, it gets a lot of things right in the way it does layout and everything like that.
Totally.
Most of the way it works is really good. So it's kind of a small subset of an issue. It's not like a whole language issue, which I think could be misread, which I know you're not saying. Yep. But just for people out there hearing CSS is flawed, not the way it does most everything that it does. A lot of the way that it allows you to style your pages is awesome, but the way that you have to load it in, like lazy loading, like we were talking about, and lack of modularity is a problem in applications at scale. Yeah, scoping.
Oh, no, no. Scoping, I just don't know CSS, so that's probably why I have scoping issues. Sorry, I'm just joking.
Well, everything is flawed to one extent or another.
Exactly.
But something that can kind of resonate or bring that home is the amount of work and tooling that has to be done to make it performant. So I do all of this stuff, Sean. Like I generate critical CSS so that the above the fold stuff renders, and then I run everything through purge CSS to make sure that the actual bundle is as small as is needed for the whole website. And it would be really nice if there were smart ways that the CSS could be lazy loaded. And I know there are CSS and JS solutions to do that, but there's a lot of tooling that you need to do and a lot of work you need to do to make the CSS work in a nice performant way.
Exactly.
Yeah, and not to mention things like critical CSS, and I almost see that as just like a hack, to like fix the problem for now.
That's absolutely right. Like, critical CSS is just a hack or a workaround that there's no lazy loading, right?
Right. Well, everything's a hack.
Sure. Yeah, I can tell there's probably a sensitive CSS community out there. People, I love CSS. I think it's really cool. As a bundler maintainer or somebody who's trying to statically analyze it and make it really performant, it is really frustrating to work with.
Yeah. I'm sure. Hey, Jake, you had something that you wanted to ask Sean about in terms of module support in browsers, right?
Oh, yeah. So we were talking earlier before the show about kind of what's coming to Webpack and how browsers are evolving. And my question was, how are new browser features that are being implemented, things like dynamic module import being built into browsers, how is that going to help the Webpack team have to do less and allow you guys to focus on other things? Like with dynamic module support, once that lands in all of the evergreen browsers, and it might be there, I don't know the answer there.
It's not.
Yeah, okay. So once that lands, does it reduce a lot of the work that you have to do? I mean, will our Webpack bundles drop by 30% because you don't have to do some of the hacks that you have to do? What new browser features are going to make what Webpack has to do even less?
So we can focus on dynamic import first. So dynamic import, for those who don't know, is this way of dynamically loading a JavaScript module. You can think of it before this, you'd have to like fetch a JavaScript file, unsecurely evaluate it, and then use that functionality. That was like the previous times. But today, like, let's say you're not using build tools. This allows you to actually have a dynamic additional loading of a file on demand, right? But there's limitations, right? And I criticize using native modules in general, like entirely, right? I have a lot of criticisms for it because it misses some of the mark in some ways, which is like, if you think of all the work that a bundler has to do at build time, a browser has to do all of that at runtime.
Right.
Resolve a module, create the graph, execute the scripts in the right order, hoist things in different asynchronous, whatever, etc. And so one of the downsides of the dynamic import is that, one, it's kind of insecure, right? Like you can't really, I don't know, I'm not a huge fan of just the whole untrusted sources or there's that concern, but also lazy loading anything has a cost, right? So any technique in programming has a cost. So lazy loading's cost is the user experience having to see waiting for the network, right? And so you have to actually find a solution for that. When you just do it dynamically, there is no solution. The user will have to wait for a dynamic import to occur. They'll wait for the network time, and then you'll get the module and it'll be evaluated. But with tools like Webpack, which statically create, so like at build time, we create these lazy loaded bundles. You can do things like put these in a service worker cache, let them be available instantly to the network. So like you can negate network time completely when you are able to actually build lazy loaded bundles prior to actually loading in the browser.
Interesting. So are there other features that you're really excited about that kind of remove some complexity or some of the heavy lifting? And our browsers pretty good? I mean, you're on the Edge team, so maybe there's some internal pushing through that team, but are browsers cooperating to make Webpack's job easier and make the code that Webpack ships smaller, or are, for the most part, they kind of trying to imagine a world without Webpack?
There are some people in the Chrome team who would love to do away with it, right? Because it kind of removes some control they have over the web platform, right? Like the bundler ecosystem really has a large say into new things that are added into specs, right? So I don't want to get too controversial, right? Because there are some standards maintainers who have really worked really well with our team. There's also some who have tried to undermine any capability that Webpack has. And so
that's what we want. We want to hear the dirt.
No, tell us about that.
It's just long story short. One time I found a online shared document that talked about kind of a strategy to remove bundlers entirely from the web ecosystem by slowly introducing new web APIs that made them irrelevant. And so I'm like, oh geez, now I'm going to sound like I'm paranoid anytime I bring this up to people. Or
was it the Russians?
No, it wasn't. It was just two specific folks on a specific browser that's specifically popular.
Wow. Sean, sometimes they really are out to get you.
Well, I don't. Anyways, but
you will say no more.
I can't say too much more. I just don't want to. But So here's the thing. So I don't know. I'm going to criticize and say this browser team has tried so hard to make native modules fast that they're willing to introduce these new exotic API capabilities, like signed bundled exchange, top level await, any new standard. You have to be super paranoid. You're are you just trying to make modules fast because they're way slower than bundling? And a lot of times we'll say, oh, no, it's for this or that. And it's But
So you're
really,
like always questioning what the real motive is.
right. Like, so that's why I wasn't always a huge fan of top level await, right? Because it's literally just supposed to make, like, because calculating the module graph dynamically at runtime is incredibly slow, and especially if there's asynchronous functions in between it, and it can cause like huge performance hits. So, but like, yeah, at the end of the day, like, to answer your question, Jake, the ironic thing is that actually the work that a bundler does is really small. Like, our wrapper code is 4 kilobytes, not even.
Wow.
Right? It's just 4 kilobytes. Yeah. Anything else is the code that you include into your bundles, right? Or the lazy loading runtime is like, I don't know, like 1 extra K. Like, it's super simple. Yeah, I think it's like 4.1, I think. I can never remember. It might be even smaller if you minify it. But yeah, like, it's super small. But like, there are some, like, what I have been really positive about is that there are new standards that are inspired by the way that people are using code powered by Webpack, right? So CSS modules, HTML modules are two active specs that have been heavily influenced and really designed based on the way that people in the Webpack ecosystem have used it, right? And so going back 3 years, I remember reaching out to, what's his name? He's the creator of Johnny 5. He's on TC39, and I reached out naively one day and I said, hey, do you think it would ever be possible to standardize importing, I don't know, like HTML into a JavaScript file or CSS in a JavaScript file? He said, no, never. But now we're like 2 years later, right? And it's like, wow, we're already here. Where the things we never thought would be possible, or finally standards implementers are listening. And maybe it has to do with me also having really open and strong representation here at Microsoft who want to help make bundling a core facet of how we build the web today.
It can't hurt to have an 800-pound gorilla behind you,
Right?
Yeah.
Yep. And it turns out they heavily depend on it as well.
Yeah.
It's nice.
I mean, it most definitely could hurt if the gorilla's not on your side. Just saying.
I mean, we've already seen that with a lot of web APIs that have been created, right?
Yeah. Well, let's steer away from the controversial stuff and talk about some pretty cool stuff. So, what is coming in Webpack 5? Like, what are the major things that are like if you had to just list on a slide the bullet points of what is going to be in Webpack 5, what would they be?
Okay. I even like have a list here because it's been a little bit, we've been in alpha for a long time because Tobias went on paternity leave for a second kid. And so I said, like, hey, dude, take your time.
Right.
So let me just grab the full changelog and I can give you the summary, right?
Yeah. And the other thing that I want to, I personally, for my own selfish reasons, I want to know, because I made this, huge, do everything for me kind of Webpack config for Webpack 4. How much work is it going to be for me to update this for Webpack 5?
Always a valid question.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll just kind of talk about the general direction, really, because there's not a lot of like signature features in Webpack 5 that are like something you want to write home about. The largest one I would say is we finally implemented, we had to do a lot of re-architecture to implement long-term or persistent disk caching, right? So if you think about a plugin in our ecosystem called the hard source Webpack plugin, it kind of allowed you to, instead of when a bundle is generated, it would generate a cache file, right? And it would cache a lot of the expensive work involved in creating bundles. And so now we do this by default. It's not in a perfect state. It's pretty experimental, but that's how we take every new feature, right? We've always done this. So like that's one of the biggest features that's going to really heavily impact large scale builds. So like customers that of Webpack that I can think of, like Airbnb is going to heavily benefit.
Right.
Us here at Microsoft are going to heavily benit.
And anyone that's doing these massive builds, right?
Absolutely, right.
Yeah.
So they're going to hugely benefit. And even like just like, mom and pop shops or like dev agencies, like they're going to see the benefits as well. Well,
that's the one resource that we can never get back is time, right?
That's very true.
Yeah.
And it's so valuable. So the second, I think, maybe largest feature is that we rewrote our ID system, right? So the determinism or the way that we generate hashes for bundles has changed. So in production, we generate hashes now by default. We won't generate a super long one. It'll be non-collision, but it'll be shorter. So there's some small benefits there, but.
So we don't have to put like the name token or whatever in there anymore, or the hash token to get the.
That is correct. And so that'll be default in our production mode. In our development mode, we'll actually have named chunks, right? So now all your lazy loaded bundles, you won't have to use like webpack chunk name when you dynamically import. You'll just get the name chunks by default, and we'll infer it based on the file system. So those are two. That second feature was heavily inspired by what Parcel could do, right? We saw like, hey, they have named chunks, and everybody's like, why should we have to set this? And we had good reasons, but we could do better, right? So we did that, but it did require us to like really rewrite our determinism. So now it means that you're going to get real long-term caching also. So you don't have to use like crazy witchcraft to prevent hashes from changing. And you may know, if you've been with Webpack for a long time, there's always been some weird reasons that hashes would change between builds for persistent caching. So that is fixed, right? So we have those. I'd say those are the largest features.
When I was looking through the changelog, like what concerned me the most for semi-obvious reasons is that I had literally just finished this deep dive and this config and everything, and then I saw the tweet go out saying Webpack 5 alpha, and I'm just like, oh God, are you kidding me? But when I looked through the change list, it looked like a lot of it. I mean, I'm not minimizing the work that's has been done under the hood, but a lot of it looked like the things that were deprecated in Webpack 4 are now really going to be gone in Webpack 5.
Right, and that you're absolutely right. And we have to kind of take a slow approach. Like we respect that we are heavily dependent on now. And so what we do is we'll deprecate in one major version, and then we'll remove in the next major version. So yes, there's a lot of stuff that was deprecated and it's getting removed. We didn't drop AMD support, did we? No, we didn't.
So, I mean, it appeared to me, at least on the surface, and I haven't played with Webpack 5 at all yet, but on the surface, it appeared to me that if you have done the quality of life to get everything up to the modern way of doing things vis-a-vis Webpack 4, that you're going to have a pretty easy transition to Webpack 5 for the most part.
Exactly. Right? This is going to be a pretty painless update. And there's like most breaking changes may exist for like custom plugins, and we'll work with those people.
Right.
And we own most of the custom plugins. So
yeah, I mean, the majority of the plugins we depend on, or that at least I depend on, are first party anyway, I guess.
Exactly.
See, Jonathan, all that work that we did on Webpack, the Webpack 4 config, it's going to be worth it because it's going to work with Webpack 5, and away we go.
And now our builds will be faster, I guess.
And anything that doesn't work, Sean has said that he's going to spend as much time as he needs to fix our Webpack config for us.
I was just doing a performance analysis to see how much CSS you had unused, and I was pretty impressed.
Yeah. Oh, good.
Yeah, it sounds like you all are doing things definitely the right way.
Trying. So that is actually, as we're kind of wrapping up the podcast, it is something I wanted to ask you is, given that you're high profile on Webpack, something that confuses people, does everyone and their brother just ask you to like fix their Webpack problem?
So you have to think of it from my perspective. This was like when I joined Microsoft, this was like the first time I've ever worked at a ginormous company. Mm-hmm. So like I kind of leaned in right to my presence in Webpack, but nobody even knew who most people here who aren't really in the web ecosystem or JavaScript have no idea who I am. Right. So
right.
Most of these are C#, C++ developers turned into now doing web dev.
Mm-hmm.
They don't go to conferences. They don't go on Twitter. So the first thing I did when I started here is I created this internal Microsoft Teams channel called Webpack at Microsoft. And so I reached out to as many people as possible on as many distribution lists and said, hey, my name's Sean. I just started here on the Edge team. You might know me as one of the maintainers of the Webpack project. Here's a channel that you can join. If you ever have questions or you ever want to have a perf evaluation, I would love for you to document like what version of Webpack you're on and what products this is, and really and build the ecosystem, like in my first 6 months. But like to my benefit though, like strategically, this helped got my name out instantly to everybody across campus.
Right.
And it was really beneficial, right? Because I could go out to a team and have huge impact using with seemingly little effort, right? Because this is my bread and butter knowledge.
Well, I want to make it clear to anyone who's listening now that Sean is talking about in the context of his employer that pays him.
Yes.
Okay, so if you're listening to this, that doesn't mean that Sean said he wants everyone to send them their webpack config to fix, right?
Well, we work really hard on our docs, right? So I always say, please check the docs first, especially if it's like, can I do this or how do I do this? Like we try really, really, really hard to get that right. I always tell people my DMs are open. I think as of now, I've gotten way busier, and so like I'm a little bit slower to respond to them. But like I try and at one point, like once a month, I try to get through all of my unread messages and respond to them and say like, sorry, is this still a problem? Do you need help? So yeah, I don't mind a little bit of unsolicited help, but like it's also my free time, right? And so if I'm not spending a huge amount of time on contributing to Webpack, or I'm not spending a lot of time at work or traveling across the world speaking at conferences, it's family time.
Right.
So I don't mind a message whatsoever. Like I'll always say hi to you, especially if you DM me. My DMs are open for a reason. So feel free to reach out.
What time of month do you check all those, just so I know when to DM you strategically?
I just roll a dice, and it's whatever day I choose. Yeah. I don't know. It doesn't matter. You can reach out anytime. I just try to tell people like expect a slow response, right?
Well, and I've got another time-related question to ask you about. And we're winding down the podcast, so I just want to ask you on a personal note, what inspired you to start learning Mandarin Chinese?
Oh, I love the ecosystem. Like China is this like untapped treasure trove of brilliant engineers, and the scale is like 100x of us, right?
Right.
And I've always loved the food. I've always loved the people. You go over there and they treat you like amazing. The culture is so virtually different.
So does it come out of your job spending time over there, and that's how you got exposed to it and decided to start learning?
It started actually as like a so at college, one of our prerequisites was we had to have one culture credit. And so you could take a language, or you could do what's called China trip. And
well, sign me up for the China trip.
Dr. Pa, who is the economics professor, but he's from China, he would take a group of students over, and like you only had to pay like $1,500 for like you'd spend 3 weeks in China, right? And it's flight included, everything's included. And the only like thing you had to do is like come back and say, how do you play Chinese chess, xiangqi? And like that was your only prerequisite and your homework for the single culture credit. So we're like, okay. But once I went over there, I was blown away. I loved it. It's like you're in a fantasy land, and like things are so different, and the culture is so different, and so I love it. And I really like, so now I want to help. Like, so here at Microsoft, we have what we call diversity core priorities, right? So diversity, inclusion, core priorities. So like every one of us who has a review, we have a core priority to work on how are we going to increase diversity and inclusion in some way through our job. And so for me, one of the ones that I have is I want to increase our mind share and market share and presence and community inside of China and Africa. And so, this is one, it's a way for me to help have a greater presence in China, right? Because it's a completely different language, and it's...
Well, I'm impressed by your dedication, Sean. And the reason I want to mention this is that my wife, her first language is Mandarin Chinese. And she speaks a whole bunch of different dialects too and everything. And I went through the whole phase of like, oh, this is awesome, I'll just go learn it. And I realized like how stupid I actually was, because I've had such a hard time.
Memory is.
I had such a hard. Well, and that's the thing. Well, a lot of it is so foreign. Like Mao, Mao. Those are 4 different words. They mean 4 totally different things, but to me, they sound the same. Right? Like it's just my untrained Western ear. But I am super impressed that you are dedicated to learning that, because it is something that I tried and failed at.
Well, and I think it's the music major in me. I actually did a research project when I was in college, and it was on perfect pitch, right? Perfect pitch is this idea that I can play a note, and you as a person can like know what that note is, right? Or like, let's say if you heard a song and somebody tuned it by like 5 hertz up or down, you would say like, this feels wrong, right? Because your perfect pitch expects it to be in that exact frequency or note. So this is something that typically you're only born with, or at least that's what scientists thought.
Okay, well, that explains it, because I'm totally tone deaf. So I remember vividly my grandmother when I was a child. She said, "Oh, your grandfather who had since passed away, had such a wonderful voice. Like, I wonder if you had that too. Like, try singing something. So I did, like, I sang something, and she just shook her head and said, "Oh, probably not," and then walked away.
The first version of the devMode podcast theme song, Andrew actually sung it, and we had to scrap it.
Yeah, but we have taken far too much of your time. We got to wind this down.
Of course.
So that about wraps it up for another episode of the devMode.fm podcast. To have every episode delivered to your favorite podcast player, subscribe to our RSS or subscribe via iTunes or Google Play. And if you like what we're doing, leave us a review. You can follow us on Twitter at devModeFM, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode. Leave a comment on the devMode.fm website. For the devMode.fm podcast, I'm Andrew Welch.
I'm Jonathan Melville.
Jake Dohm.
And thank you very much for coming on, Sean.
Hey, thanks for having me, and always bet on JavaScript.
Jake told me to weave that in there. He told me to weave in the bet on JavaScript, and I totally failed and didn't do it.
Don't worry.
I got it. No, he said it.
I got it.
Well, I know he said it, but you told me to sneak it in there.
We were talking before the show. I was like, cue up Sean to say something about betting on